Hello, and welcome to Dyslexia Devoted, the podcast dedicated to building awareness, understanding, and strategies to help those with dyslexia. I'm your host, Lisa Parnello, dyslexia therapist and founder of Parnello Education Services. Join me as we dive into today's episode of Dyslexia Devoted. Hello, amazing Dyslexia Devoted listeners. I am so excited to be back with you guys today. It has been a whirlwind last couple of weeks, and there was absolutely no way a podcast was going to get recorded last week. I have been so busy in the world of dyslexia, actually, so a very valid reason to miss a dyslexia podcast. I first was in Boston in my annual Wilson Trainer meeting, and I love that trip every year for various reasons. Partly for the good friends, the good company, the good town, and also because of all the cool things I learned about dyslexia. And then last week, I was a part of not one, not two, but 3 adult training situations. I did the Back to School Science of Reading Summit, and I did the Building Readers for Life annual conference, and I did an in-person training for educators who work with Stanford students who have ADHD and dyslexia. So last week was a lot. And all of these things were also happening while I'm still running summer program. Obviously, the trip to Boston. I was not teaching kids while I was in Boston. But all the other things were all happening while I was also teaching summer school kids. And I say summer school, it's not really school, it's just me and a kid working one-on-one, but they're all the kids who I don't normally see during the school year. So my schedule is packed, and so the only way some of these kids see me is just during summer. So even when I have a lot going on, I try not to cancel on them. So all of these events in the world of dyslexia have inspired this week's episode. Number 108 of Dyslexia Devoted is what happens when adults can't read. So this episode was inspired by my trip to Boston. Every year I take something really valuable away from it, whether it's, better ways to train teachers, better ways to teach kids, or something about the latest research in the world of education. There were a couple things that lit up all sorts of ideas for me. But the one that had the biggest impact on me was the panel about adults with dyslexia. And there was a panel of people who did not learn to read when they were younger, who did not learn to read until they were adults. And if you've been listening for a while, you've heard me talk about the number of people who are in prison who can't read, or who are reading below a 4th grade level. In fact, a vast majority of people who are in jail are poor readers, because when you can't read, you get into all sorts of trouble. But not everybody makes bad choices just because they can't read. So this panel was a bunch of adults who have all chosen to learn how to read after they became adults. And I think that is something so important to point out, is that it's never too late to learn how to read. So I'm going to talk about a few of the people who are on the panel. I'm not going to use their names because I didn't ask permission to talk about them. So I want to honor their, privacy and whatnots. Although I do realize they were speaking to a room of like hundreds, if not thousands of people, but that's okay. So one of them actually works for Wilson and works in their warehouse team and is having somebody at Wilson teach them how to read, which is so cool because they're working at a place that helps people with dyslexia while they themselves have dyslexia and are finally learning how to read as an adult. And the thing that I found the most powerful about this wonderful young woman's story is that she was willing to share it. How many people in their early 20s are willing to tell you they can't read? Not many. It takes bravery to be able to say, I can't do this, I need help. And that's a big thing. That's a big deal. There was another person who got into a ton of trouble when they were younger and went to alternative schools for high school. And eventually they found a tutor when they were about 18 or so. And that person taught them how to read. And they stopped getting into trouble. And they eventually went on to earn their doctorate and write comic books about kids with dyslexia. And then we have another person who went on to become a professor. It wasn't until she was older, after she had graduated high school, she somehow graduated despite the fact that she couldn't read, which that's like a whole other problem of our educational system, that people can graduate from high school not knowing how to read. That baffles my mind. Like, how is that even possible? Like, what school is like, here's your diploma. It's okay that you can't read. You've graduated. You've done enough. How is that a thing? Anyway, she was very motivated and worked her tail off and not only learned how to read, but she graduated from college and even became a professor in college. And she fully admits to her students that she has dyslexia, there will be spelling mistakes on her PowerPoints, and that she's proud that she is able to teach them and take her experiences and share them with future generations. Because it's not necessarily that everyone has the right socioeconomic status to get all the help they need when they're younger. It's really quite sad, but dyslexia is one of those things that a lot of school systems don't train their teachers on how to help kids, so it's only people who can afford tutors who are able to get help early and often. And unfortunately, that means a lot of people end up graduating without learning how to read. So it's up to them as an adult to eventually figure out someone who can help them and provide support and eventually teach them how to read. And another person that shared his story was a former NBA player that graduated from high school and college and never became a fluent reader. And how he went on to eventually now have Barbara Wilson as his tutor. Because if you don't know who she is, she's the founder of Wilson Reading. And what a lot of people don't know is that she actually still works with students from time to time. Usually when a friend of hers asks her to do a favor for someone that they know. And she genuinely loves teaching adults to read. And the reading program that she created was actually intended to help adults learn to read, and then has since become adapted to help kids learn to read. And I know this sounds like it is a big Wilson commercial. That is really not its purpose whatsoever. It is mostly that it is the program I happen to be trained in and that I have trained teachers to use. And it is where I have a big cluster of friends and get to attend this cool event every year and learn something new. And as you know, this podcast is always inspired by whatever is happening in my life at the time or whatever questions you guys as listeners have asked me. So that is where my life is this week, is that I was in the world of Wilson. But any, structured literacy that has explicit instruction on phonics and morphology and comprehension, those are all happy in my book. And then the other thing that came up this past week is I got to spend a few hours with a wonderful group of educators who work with Stanford students who have ADHD and dyslexia. So last week, I was giving them strategies on how to help their college students with their reading. Now, you might be thinking, wait, they go to Stanford. Don't they already know how to read? Well, this is where things get a little complicated. When you think about how many people learned how to read, a lot of it had to do with looking at pictures and context clues. So once you are reading different topics that you've never learned before, and you can't rely on pictures and you can't rely on context clues because you have no context for this brand new subject you're learning now, then those bad reading strategies you learned when you were younger start to rear their ugly heads. And one of the things I really was helping them on is it's never too late to learn to read. So when I was at that conference and listening to the panel of adults who didn't learn to read until they were adults, it really hit me how important it was going to be when I go talk to these educators about how it's never too late to learn how to read. If you don't teach them to read in college, they really are done unless they have some sort of external motivation to learn how to read outside of college. And really emphasizing it's never too late to learn how to read. Even if you've made it all the way to Stanford and you've got a lot of coping strategies, what about in the real world? What if something goes wrong and your boss hands you a presentation to suddenly do without expecting it because the other person called in sick that day? What if there's an emergency happening and you have to read the emergency manual on what to do? There's all these things that come up in life that you can't just plan for, and your coping strategies may not actually work as great. And that's really what was in my mindset as I was helping these educators with what they're going to do to help these Stanford students become better readers while helping them through their classes as well. And you might be wondering, how did these people make it to Stanford if they have dyslexia and if they're still struggling readers? You would be amazed. In fact, one of them, which I've seen many times actually, but one instance was one of the educators said one of her students memorizes everything. They have such a vast memory and such a strong ability to memorize that they have memorized every word that they read. They don't know how to sound out anything. They just look at something, someone tells them what it is, and they memorize it. And that's their strategy for everything forever. But eventually, you run out of brain space. But, maybe they haven't hit that part yet. But the biggest problem is, what if you're reading a book with 50 new words on that page? It's really hard to learn 50 new words at once. So sometimes some of these strategies that worked really well when they were younger are not so effective now. And then the other thing about teaching adults is they have to want it. One of the educators asked me, Well, what do? We only have so much time with them every week, and they still have to pass their classes. Do we focus on their classes or do we focus on teaching them to read? Do you know what my answer was? Ask them. They're adults. What is their priority? Do they want to become a better reader? Is that something that is meaningful to their life? Do they know that if you don't teach them to read now, maybe nobody ever will? That's a really important fact to know. And it's something to think about. And sometimes someone might just say, just help me pass my classes. I don't care. I will find a job that's okay, even if I'm not the best reader. And I've seen it happen. I have somebody who actually helped encourage me to start this business that you are listening to right now on this podcast. He fully admitted he married his high school sweetheart, and she can validate this story. She helped him pass all of his classes in high school and college. She helped him pass his tests and write his essays because he has dyslexia. And he went on to be a very successful person who's been the CEO of multiple companies. And so sometimes it really is just about passing your classes because the real world doesn't really operate the same as school does. You can find jobs that meet your needs. You can find jobs that use your strengths. And those strengths can be very different things. They can be the person who owns the tree business that did all my fire clearance 2 weeks ago when I sure as heck couldn't do that. They can be the person on his staff that says, hey, I have dyslexia too. I didn't know you had dyslexia. They literally talked about their dyslexia in front of me because they actually didn't talk to each other about it, even though both of them who work together for the same company both have dyslexia. They work next to each other all the time. And then it could be the woman who owns the jewelry shop whose jewelry I'm wearing right this very minute. As I was leaving my dyslexia conference, I had some time to kill before I could get on a plane, despite the fact I already had to check out of my hotel. And I found a cute little boutique. And I was chatting with a girl as I was picking out the jewelry that I was going to take home because it was gorgeous, hand-blown glass. And I loved it. And I was chatting with her when I went to pay. And she says, so what brought you into town in the first place? And I told her it was my dyslexia conference. And she very proudly said, hey, I have dyslexia. That's so awesome that you're doing that. And I told her, that's awesome that you have dyslexia. And look at you running your own business. There's so many powerful things that can come from people who have dyslexia as adults. It does not necessarily limit your potential. And there needs to be people who will help kids and adults with dyslexia learn how to read because it's never too late. And you can still do awesome things, even if growing up and getting through school kind of sucks at first. That doesn't necessarily limit where you will go in life. I think that's the perfect way to end today. That's it. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you want to learn even more about dyslexia, check out parnelloeducation.com/courses. See you next time.